Turn over to Matthew chapter 24. If you're not already over there in your Bibles, if you were here this morning, you know that we're continuing a lesson and a study on Matthew 24. We already looked at the context of the teaching that Jesus gives here in this chapter, but I'm actually going to begin with the verse that we ended with this morning. I'm not going to read from Matthew's account, though. I'm going to read from Luke's account. And I mentioned if you really only have one to study, this is probably the better one to do because it's a lot of straightforward language that you'll find here. But Luke really emphasizes the idea of Jesus addressing the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple itself. Luke writes this in Luke 21 and verse 5. He says, "Then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, 'These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.' So they asked him, saying, 'Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?'" So basically, Luke kind of just emphasizes, or maybe I should say isolates, the question of Jesus' disciples in the first part of this chapter being about the stones that would be overturned. We talked this morning about how one stone, or Jesus said one stone wouldn't be stacked on top of another. All the buildings, all the stonework of the area of the temple. And the disciples really had two questions. The first one was, when is this going to happen? And then the second one would be, how are we going to know this is going to happen? What are the signs that are going to take place before this actually happens? So Matthew chapter 24 is a two-part answer of Jesus a two-answer reply of Jesus that is given to two different questions by the disciples. And so as we begin again tonight, I want to emphasize when we're talking about the end, when Jesus is talking about the end here in the first chapter, he's talking about the end of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and that I think will become more obvious as we go on throughout this study. So we ended on the note this morning. We were talking about what were the indicators of the end. Of course, Jesus spent the first part of the chapter talking about what were not the indicators of the end. These things are going to happen. They're considered major catastrophes. A lot of people will think that bad things are coming along with them, but that's just not the case. They're not the end. Doesn't mean the end is even close or at hand. But there were some things that would happen that would indicate that the end was near. The first thing that we looked at this morning was that the gospel would be preached throughout all the world. So I'm not going to spend all of our time tonight talking about the same thing we talked about this morning. But the second thing that we really want to indicate or emphasize that is an indicator of the end is the abomination of desolation. Now, if you look at verse 14, we're in Matthew chapter 24 again. Jesus, of course, backing up to verse 14, talks about how the gospel is going to be preached in all the world, and then shall the end come. Then he says this in verse 15. He says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." So Jesus is referring to a vision that Daniel received. Now, that vision is recorded for us in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, verses 23 through 27. Initially, whenever I was putting this lesson together, I thought, this is great. We're going to get to go back in the Old Testament. We're going to go talk about some of the prophecies there and talk about the 70 weeks of Daniel and things like that. I don't have time to do that. There's no way. But just be mindful that 500 years before this ever happened, Daniel saw this vision and he wrote it down. And so Jesus refers to what Daniel wrote down, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel wrote about, then know that the end is near, it is close. Now again, it's not the end of the world. It's not the second coming of Christ. It's the end of Jerusalem, the end of the temple, the destruction of that city and its holy buildings. So here's what I will do, which I think is a lot easier than going back and going through Daniel and explaining the 70 weeks and all that. Turn back one chapter in Matthew chapter 23. I want you to look toward the end of the chapter in about verse 36 beginning. And here's what Jesus says. He says, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come to pass upon this generation." Now notice verse 37. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." He's addressing the city as a whole. "Thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not." Notice verse 38 now. "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." Okay, understand what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is pointing out, he's describing retribution that's getting ready to come upon the city of Jerusalem. Remember, he addresses, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." He's talking to the city as a whole. Well, what is going to happen to that city? Well, he talks about the way that they treated God's scribes and his prophets, and of course his son, as they're going to treat him. And even after that, God's going to send more wise men and more scribes and more prophets. And what are they going to do to those people? Well, they're going to kill them, they're going to beat them, they're going to persecute them. And so God is going to punish them for that. What was the punishment? He says, "Your house is going to be left unto you desolate." Now, what is he talking about? The city of Jerusalem, that's the house that he's talking about. You remember, he's addressing the city. Your house is going to be empty. Your house is going to be destroyed or taken away. And so he's already prophesying or talking about this fact in Matthew chapter 23. So what does Jesus say when he's talking about desolation there? He's talking about the emptying of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. A lot of the people are going to die there. Some are going to be carried away captive. Not good things are going to happen within that city, but their house is going to be left empty and destroyed. Now, thankfully, when you read the New Testament, Luke's account, you don't have to wonder what the abomination of desolation is, because Luke spells it out in black and white for us. In Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, here's what Luke says. And remember, this is one of those synoptic accounts of Matthew 24. He says, "When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." So who is it that's going to desolate or empty Jerusalem? Well, it's an army of some sorts, isn't it? So what in the world is Jesus talking about? What was Daniel talking about when he was talking about an abomination of desolation? He was talking about something that in the eyes of the Jews was an abomination to them. They were the ones who were going to desolate the house or desolate Jerusalem. They were the ones who were going to empty it. Well, what was that abomination? It was an army, right? Luke chapter 21. Well, think about this. What army would have been in existence at that time that would have been an abomination to the Jews? Well, the answer is the Roman army. And that's exactly what happened whenever you study human history. In about AD 70, about 40 years later from when Jesus would speak these words, Titus would come with the Roman army, and he would destroy the city of Jerusalem, and he would absolutely demolish the temple and the temple area itself. And so Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the Roman army compassing the city of Jerusalem, then you know that it's getting ready to be destroyed, and that one stone is not going to be left stacked upon another. Now, notice what he goes on to say in verse 16 there of Matthew chapter 24. And here's another reason we know that the end that he's talking about here is not the end of the world. He says in verse 16, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day." So here's what Jesus is saying. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the Roman army surround the city of Jerusalem, then you better know that immediate and utter destruction is coming upon this city. So if we see the Roman army, what should we do? Jesus said, you run for the hills. He said, you don't go back. You don't go back to your house and say, there's some things here that are special to me. I don't want to leave them behind. I'm going to make sure I want to get them with me. You might get trapped. You don't go back to take any clothes. Even if your outer cloak, which in that day and age, understand the outer garment was basically considered life and death for most people. He said, even if you've left your outer coat, don't go back into the city of Jerusalem. Instead, you run into the mountains, you flee there, and you find safety there. Well, we know that can't be the second coming of Christ, right? Because that's not going to be possible. So he's talking again about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he also adds these words of caution. He says, you better pray that you're not pregnant or you don't have small children. You think about a mother or somebody who is pregnant or a mother of small children, how difficult it would be to get them and get out of the city in time. He also said you better pray it's not on the Sabbath day when this happens. Why? Well, not only did people not, by law, were not allowed to go anywhere on the Sabbath day, but to try to deter that, the gates of Jerusalem were often shut on the Sabbath day, which made it very difficult for you to even get outside of the city. So Jesus emphasizes when you see this happen, when you see this abomination of desolation, the Roman army surround the city of Jerusalem, get out of there, don't go back, don't try to save anything, just run for the hills as fast as you can. What else is going to indicate that this city and the temple is going to be destroyed? Well, he describes here what is known as the Great Tribulation. Notice in verse 21. He says, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Why is it called the Great Tribulation? Well, as Jesus describes it there in verse 21, he pointed out it's a tribulation that has been unequaled from the beginning of the world. And not only is it a tribulation, or it's going to be a tribulation that nobody has experienced, no part of humanity has experienced thus far. He also says this, there's not going to be anything like it again until the end of the world. So we could safely say it's the greatest tribulation that humanity has ever experienced, the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, if you want to read about some of that great tribulation, I told you this morning about Josephus. You got a strong mind, you can read about some of it. But just understand this. Listen, a little bit of history behind this. The idea of the Jews rebelling against Rome actually started under the reign of Nero. There was a Jewish rebellion about somewhere between 66, 68 AD. And Nero had a commander of his army, Vespasian. And Vespasian was the one who was in charge of squashing that rebellion. So Vespasian, he goes out and he squashes that rebellion, but there's always some bitterness in his mind because he really wanted to get to Jerusalem and to the temple. But Nero wouldn't allow him to do that. Well, some things happened in the Roman hierarchy. Nero got out of power, and eventually Vespasian comes into ruling over Rome. And whenever he enters into ruling over Rome, he takes his son Titus, puts him in charge of the Roman army, and sends him to Jerusalem to take care of the Jews and the city and the temple. So understand, this guy is upset whenever he sends Titus after them. Now, I think that Titus and probably Vespasian himself, they probably thought this is not going to be much of a battle. But if you read about it in history, the Jews actually held out for about 5 months in the city of Jerusalem. And that just made Titus angrier and angrier. And the last stronghold that they were able to retain there within Jerusalem was the temple area. And so you can imagine when Titus gets to the temple area, he is furious. And eventually leads to him burning it to the ground along with some other things. But tells you a little bit about why it happened in that area and what happened that did happen in that area. But it's this idea of a brutal attack. You know, a tragic tribulation that has never been seen before. I'm going to read one line from Josephus, which I think kind of summarizes. Again, this doesn't give us, all the grotesque details of it. But he says this. He says, there was no pity for age nor regard for rank. Little children and old men, laymen and priests alike were butchered. Every class was pursued and crushed in the grip of war, whether they cried out for mercy or offered resistance. Now understand something else about this too. Titus strategically allowed the city of Jerusalem. This happened in about April of AD 70, or began happening. And there was a very important thing that happened for the Jews at that time, and that was the Passover feast. And remember, at the Passover, you had thousands of Jews who literally poured into Jerusalem. And Titus let them all get into Jerusalem for a couple of reasons. First of all, he wanted to kill as many Jews as he could. But secondly, he wanted to deplete the supplies of the city. he probably thought, this is going to be a holdout anyway, and so we want to run their supplies down as much as we can, get this thing over as quickly as we can. So there were thousands of Jews from all over the world who came to Jerusalem. They were allowed to enter into the city, but they were not allowed to leave. And so Titus took care of a lot of those Jews. It wasn't just Jerusalem, but it was the Jewish nation itself. And a lot of those leaders that were killed in this destruction of Jerusalem. But notice Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation. In fact, verse 22 probably says it all. He says, except those days should have been shortened, there should no flesh be saved. If God had allowed this to continue to go on, every single person would have been dead within the city of Jerusalem. But God shortened it, didn't he? So, a little bit of light, I guess, at the end of the tunnel. Jesus goes on here in Matthew chapter 24, after he describes that great tribulation in verse 23, there's some warnings again about false messiahs here. I'm not going to read all those, but he talks about how people are going to say, well, the Messiah is here or there, or out in the wilderness, he's in the desert. And he says in verse 27, as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. What's he talking about? When Jesus returns, if Jesus comes back, it's not going to be a secret event, right? You're not going to have to go out in the desert to find him. You're not going to have to go in some secluded place. It's going to be known. Everybody is going to see it. He uses the illustration of verse 28. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Well, not talking about eagles like we think of today, but vultures. What do you see, or what do you think whenever you see a bunch of vultures circling in the sky? You know something's dead, right? There's something dead over there. Well, the same is true with the coming of Christ. It's not going to be secretive. You're going to see and you're going to know whenever he returns. There's going to be no doubt about it. So he talks about those indicators. Those are really the three great indicators. The gospel preached to the entire world, the city of Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman army, and then, of course, the start of what's described here as the Great Tribulation that's going to lead eventually to one stone of the temple not being stacked upon the other. So we've covered kind of the indicators here of the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's talk about, I'm pressing my button too many times here, let's talk about the description of the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, so this is where I believe most people kind of fall off the track. Because when we start reading about the coming of the Son of Man, immediately people go, well, second return, right? It's Christ coming back. In fact, there are many commentators who go through this chapter and through Mark 13 and Luke 21, and they'll talk about the destruction of Jerusalem until they get to this point, and then they'll say, oh, second coming of Christ, right? Well, let's think about a couple of things. First of all, remember how I pointed out to you this morning in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30? Jesus, after he says all these things, he says, all these things shall happen in this generation. One of the things he talks about, if you back up to verse 30, is the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, you turn over to Mark's account in Mark chapter 13. You read verse 30. Again, Jesus said, all these things, this generation will not pass away till all these things happen. Back up to verse 26. He talks about the coming of the Son of Man. You look at Luke chapter 21. You go down to verse 32. Again, Jesus said, all these things are going to be fulfilled in this generation. They're going to see it. Back up to verse 27. He talks about the coming of the Son of Man. So, I said this morning, but you have a natural division in the chapter where Jesus says, all these things that I've told you about are going to happen in this generation. And to me, for somebody to say, no, they're not, I'm going to say you misunderstood what Jesus was saying. Okay, you didn't apply it correctly or you misunderstood. Because Jesus said it would. It's kind of like when Jesus said in Mark 9 and verse 1, he said, there's some people that are standing here that shall not die until they see this kingdom of God come with power. What would you say if somebody stood up and said, no, that's not right? You'd say, yeah, it's right. You just misunderstood. You didn't apply Jesus' teaching correctly. So what in the world is Jesus talking about, the coming of the Son of Man? Well, I'll give you a couple of things to think about here tonight. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but there are certainly things that indicate this is what's known as symbolic language. Okay, it's not literal. Too many times I think, well, maybe I'll talk about that. Let's look at verse 29. Immediately, okay, we're not talking about 2,000 years later, right? Immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. What in the world is he talking about there? Is he talking about literal things that are going to happen? Well, again, immediately after the tribulation, after the great tribulation we just read about, studied here in Matthew 24, was the sun darkened? Did the moon not shine? Did the stars fall from heaven, literally? No. So we're not talking about literal language here, right? Well, what in the world are we talking about then? Well, we're talking about this, what's known as prophetic language. If you want, again, depends on how much of a stomach you've got to really research some of these things. Read the book of Ezekiel. Read the book of Isaiah. Read especially Ezekiel 32, where he talks about God coming in the clouds of heaven with judgment upon Egypt. It wasn't a literal coming of God in the clouds of heaven, but what do you see when you see clouds coming your way? Well, you think a storm's coming, right? There's severe weather that's headed our way. Well, that's used prophetically, symbolically, to represent the wrath of God. So the wrath of God is coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus is coming in the clouds of heaven for what purpose? To judge Jerusalem, to judge the Jews. And you read about in verse 29 again, if this is symbolic language, and I would think we all would say it absolutely is, the sun wasn't literally darkened. Okay, the moon literally didn't shine after the tribulation of those days. The stars didn't literally fall from heaven, right? We look at that and we say, well, that's symbolic language. Well, if what he's talking about is symbolic language, does it make sense that what he says next is symbolic too? Notice what he says in verse 30 and 31. Well, maybe I should just mention this real quickly. I'm not going to read it, but Acts chapter 2. If you look at Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, the pouring out of the Spirit that Joel prophesied about, literally what's mentioned there is the very same language. In fact, if you were to look in Acts chapter 2 and verse 9, he says, I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor and smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. Did that literally happen? No. Then what is he writing about? He's writing about world-changing events. Okay, that's what these things stand for. Listen, if the sun didn't shine, would that change the world that we live in? If the moon literally was dark, if the the stars literally fell out of heaven, would that change our world in any way? Yeah, that's what he's talking about. Some life-changing things, some world-changing things are going to be happening here. And when the Spirit of God was poured out on the day of Pentecost, it literally changed the world, didn't it? But the destruction of Jerusalem also literally changed the world too. And specifically, there was some great and striking changes that took place in what we would consider world power and world influence. Because the Jewish nation, because of this event, they lost their world power, they lost their world influence that they had for so many years. But not literal application here. So if verse 29 of Matthew 24 isn't to be taken literally, why should we take verse 30 and verse 31 literally? Because we've already established this is symbolic language. If you want to be fancy, apocalyptic language is how it's worded for some reason, but it just means symbolic language. Notice in verse 30 it says, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. What in the world is he talking about? And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, I know a lot of people that I talk to, they say, listen, that sounds like the second coming of Christ. It does, except Jesus said this was going to happen before this generation passes away. Remember that. He said all these things I've told you about. So it can't be the second coming of Christ. What are they talking about? The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Well, armies in that day and age marched under a banner or a sign. And that to them, that was kind of what they would call their war sign. When you saw that war sign, you knew what army you were going to encounter or you were going to fight. Well, it's no different with Christ. When this happens, what the Jews are going to figure out is they're fighting against the Son of God. Okay, they're going to see the banner of the Son of God in heaven. They're going to realize that all these things that Jesus said about them was true. That they literally ended up killing and crucifying the Son of God. They've been persecuting His prophets. A lot of bad things that they've been doing. And they're going to know this too. They're going to know that Christ is in control. They're going to know that Christ ultimately won the battle. And people are going to see that He is the Son of God, specifically the Jewish nation itself. Can you imagine, though, the world powers and the world people who have known Israel as a extension of God's family for so long, and all of a sudden they see them almost completely wiped out? They're going to say, what in the world is happening here? What's going to take place? And the answer is, God is coming in judgment upon this nation. Not literally with the clouds of heaven, but symbolically. Like, again, read Ezekiel 32, like He did when He came upon Egypt, symbolically with the clouds of heaven, punish them and their nation. But people will see that He's God. They'll wail because of the terrible judgment that's being inflicted upon them. And you might ask about the question here, well, what about the angels being sent out, with the sound of the trumpet, gathering all the elect from the four corners of the earth? Well, what was one of the strongest oppositions to Christianity in the beginning? It was Judaism, wasn't it? It was the Jews. Everywhere you read about where Paul goes, what is he constantly encountering? He's encountering opposition from the Jews. They're fighting against him. The leaders are conspiring against him. And so time and time again, Judaism is opposing Christianity. And when Christ came upon Jerusalem in judgment, do you know what He did? He put the death nail in the coffin of Judaism. Because there were some things that happened that day that have not been reversed since. But a couple of things that are pretty interesting. First of all, the Jews didn't just go back and rebuild the temple. The iron fist of the Romans wouldn't allow it. And even to this day, the real temple has not been rebuilt. Still. You know what else happened to all the articles that you read about in the temple, the important articles like, the altar and the showbread and all that thing? Those things were carried away into obscurity. They went into Rome, they stood there. I think Vespasian kept them as a kind of a trophy for a while. But nobody really knows what happened to them. They just kind of vanished off the face of the earth. And so those things were never brought back to Jerusalem. The temple was never rebuilt. The Jews never had the same power and influence like they had during the days of Christ. So think about what that meant for the gospel. Well, that meant a lot of freedom, didn't it? And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. That word that's translated as angels, probably mentioned it before, but a lot of times it's just simply translated messenger. It doesn't always mean spiritual beings. Sometimes it's just human beings sent by God. After Judaism is destroyed, after that world power, that thing that has been deterring the spread of the gospel for so long is destroyed, Jesus is going to send His messengers out into all the world. They're not going to have to fight against it anymore. They're going to go to all the edges of the earth. They're going to be bringing in so many more people. And so I believe that there's a symbolic application of that, and undoubtedly I have to believe that's what Jesus meant, because He said this is going to happen in this generation. So it's not unexplainable. Here's what I was going to say before I started explaining it. I don't want to say this in a derogatory way, but it's kind of been my experience with humanity, not with the church in general, although it's true within the church too. But with humanity in general, that we like the easiest explanation. You ever notice that? Whatever's simple, whatever's easy. So the easiest thing would be to read this and say, that's the second coming of Christ. But the problem is, that's not right. Because of what Jesus told us, that all these things are going to happen before this generation passes away. So is it more difficult to go and explain it? Sure. But I believe it's the right application because, again, Jesus was talking about things that would happen within that first period of 100 or before 100 AD. And so you have to say those are things that did happen before then. Okay, let's mention about this last real quickly, the lesson of the fig tree that Jesus gives to end it up. He says, now learn a parable of the fig tree, verse 32. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when ye see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. Jesus used the fig tree to teach a lesson of nearness. And here's what the Jews knew. In the winter, we understand this, the fig tree loses its leaves in the winter. But what happens in the spring? Well, they begin to bud and the leaves come out. And when you see things budding and the leaves coming out, you know that summer's right around the corner, don't you? You know it's close. And so Jesus says, understand the parable of the fig tree. You can look at the fig tree, you can see the signs that summer is getting close, it's drawing near. So when you see the signs I told you about, know that the destruction of Jerusalem is close. It's at hand, it's very near too. Be mindful of that. When you see the signs, hightail it and get out of Jerusalem, and don't go back for anything. But as we end, I again want to emphasize what I've called throughout this study, these themes of chapter 24. And there's a kind of connection. If you underline in your Bible, I'd encourage you to underline this. If you don't, it's no big deal. Just draw an arrow. But if you go back to verse 2 of Matthew 24, Jesus asked them this question. He says, see ye not all these things? His disciples come to him. They ask him a question in verse 3. They say, when shall these things be? And when you get down to verse 33 and 34, he says, likewise, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. You have these things from verse 34 or verse 35, if you want to include that too, backing up to chapter 1. But then in verse 36, you have a that day. You see the transition? You see the difference between the two? That Jesus draws a clear line in this chapter where he's talking about things that are going to happen within the lifetime, within that generation, things that are going to happen, as we'll study about next week. Well, we'll talk about when and what the signs of those things are going to be. But it is interesting. Those 35 verses in Matthew 24, they deal with the first question, the first answer that Jesus gave. When the destruction of Jerusalem would happen, what were the signs that would come before it did happen? And of course, next week we'll look at the second question that Jesus asked, or that his disciples asked and Jesus answered. When are you going to return? And what are going to be the signs of that return? Hope you'll join us in that study. Maybe